Hi everyone, welcome to the H France Salon. I'm Lynn Hunt, talking to you from Los Angeles.
And I'm Peter McPhee, speaking to you from the University of Melbourne. The first thing that Lynn and I would like to do is to compliment the five editors of the strands of this forum, because they've put together a series of papers, 23 papers in all, which we think are really of outstanding quality and each very interesting in their own way. They've deliberately chosen a combination of established and newer scholars. Of course, there were hundreds of scholars from whom they could have chosen, but the work of many other scholars is recognised in the documentation for the papers. Lynn and I thought it might be interesting to begin with a brief statement of how we individually came to be involved as scholars of the French Revolution. So Lynn, why don't you say something about your own trajectory?
Great, I'd love to. I got interested in the French Revolution in the first place because I was a student in the 1960s. It was a time of upheaval. Revolution was in the air. I was very influenced by Marxism. My first study, my dissertation on Troyes and Reims at the end of the old regime, the beginning of the French Revolution, was undertaken really to study the sort of Marxist interpretation on the local level. So for me, what was really important was Marxism, who made the revolution, and to look at it in two very specific places, two textile towns, one a cotton town and one a wool town. But what about you, Peter?
Yes, I came to the French Revolution in a slightly more circuitous way, but actually I have a lot in common with you and what you've just said. I was taught by a very fine historian of the French Revolution named Alison Patrick, but I was then very attracted by the work of Maurice Agoulan to study 19th century rural France, its politics, its the social structures and so on. Very influenced by the surge of peasant studies and subaltern studies that came out of the Vietnam War. But when studying 19th century rural France, what really struck me more than anything was the power of the legacy of the French Revolution, both in material terms, but also in terms of memory, ideology, culture, and that drew me back into the French Revolution. So certainly we have some things in common there, Lynn. Let's turn to talk about the various strands that the editors have put together, and the first one concerns the work that's been so important over the last 20 years or so about rethinking the French Revolution in global context. And Lynn, you've been one of the major participants in this debate, in this new direction about the French Revolution. What's your reading now of the most appropriate geographic and chronological parameters for making sense of the revolution?
I think a lot depends on what you're trying to find out. So, for example, if you're looking for the origins of the French Revolution, why things break out in 1789, it would be really hard to overlook the French Empire and the difficulties of funding the empire. So there are certain questions for which I think a truly global context, especially the context of empire and colonies, not to mention slavery, is really, really important. I think there are other contexts, though, where this is not so much the case. Most studies of the terror are very much focused on France, sometimes on Paris, sometimes on the provinces, and I think that's appropriate. So I think a lot depends on the question that's being asked, but at the same time, I think this turn to the global dimension, which we see in this strand organized by Annie Jourdan, is extremely important because we've overlooked some of the connections, I think, in the past. And these attention, for example, in this strand to Italian states, German states, the Low Countries, this is part of a global awareness, but it also shows in the case of this specific strand's papers that the influence of the French Revolution cannot possibly be studied just in a kind of Franco-centric context, but it's very much evident if we look at what happens in other countries and the long legacies of the French Revolution in the neighboring countries, but also even in places quite far away. So I think it depends on what we want to know, but I'm very enthusiastic about this opening up to a broader context.
One of the things that struck me in these papers was the importance of understanding this sort of global dynamic, if you like, in a complex way, of one of negotiation and interaction, adaptation, adoption, and confrontation. That it isn't simply a question of the influence of the French Revolution slowly spreading out like honey. That in fact, the impact of the French Revolution is one that's constantly it's in a dialogue, it's in a dialectic with other societies. I remember once coming across the case of a Breton mining engineer who was working in present-day Slovakia in the mines, and in the middle of 1794 decided to organise a banquet in honour of Maximilien Robespierre and the Temples of Reason. He didn't get very far with the local authorities, of course, but we'd be very unwise to say, oh, therefore Slovakia is a country that we can sort of tick off as being influenced by the French Revolution. It seems to me that it's always a very contested and dynamic interaction between the French Revolution and its impact elsewhere.
Oh, I think that's really true. But do you think there are any limitations, any hesitations we should have about this broadening out?
Oh, I think that we need to bear in mind that as far as contemporaries are concerned, this is very much the age of the French Revolution, and that we mustn't sort of flatten out the French Revolution into just one more example of upheaval. That it's important to understand the specificities of France, at the same time, very importantly, of understanding that there are two-way interactions going on between the perceived understandings of the French Revolution and local circumstances, not only across Europe, but across the Atlantic and well into the Mediterranean world, into the Muslim world as well. So that it really is, as you're saying, it really is a very rich area of historical work at present. But I think it raises the question, what are the geographic and chronological limits to the French Revolution now?
But I think you're right also to underline the specificities of what is happening in France, or just the French Revolution as an event, because of course in the end one of the striking things is the incredible amount of resonance this event has across the world. We need a global context to see that, but in a way it also brings us back to the fact that this is a staggeringly powerful event precisely in those international resonances.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it, that you and I were students at a time when we still debated the Palmer-Gotteschow thesis about the Atlantic Revolution, which was seen to be, in a sense, was dismissed by French scholars as part of the Cold War rhetoric, and it was so limited both in terms of what was studied and the geographic range. But it's fascinating that in the globalising world in which we live, that there's been this extraordinary renewal of interest in transnational interactions.
Yes. Although, to move on to the next question, even with all of this, the terror remains this incredibly hot button issue, not just for people who read about the French Revolution, but for us who study the French Revolution. So let's talk a little bit about that strand on the terror, and I'll ask you, Peter, to start by what you think of what is obviously emerging from these wonderful papers organized by Marissa Linton on the terror. This it's not new, but a kind of new emphasis on not talking about the terror as either a period of time or as a systematic regime that's put in place with some kind of clear ideological or political momentum, but rather as a patchwork of, in some cases, stopgap measures that don't add up to one kind of unified thing. So what do you think about that?
Yes, they are superb papers, and they really go to the heart of what is one of the most frustrating cliches, I suppose, in the public imagination about the French Revolution, and that is the way that the French Revolution and the terror, with a capital T, are so often conflated. People even refer to the reign of terror as if there was some sort of ruler named Maximilien Robespierre and so on. What these papers really underline, as you say, is that We're talking about a patchwork of emergency measures that are put in place across a period of maybe 15 months. There is no decision to impose the reign of terror at any one time. The closest that the government gets to that is on the 10th of October when they decree that government will be revolutionary until the peace. But these are papers which underline the ways in which we need to refer to the practice of terror with a small t, a term that has very different meanings in the 18th century and different antecedents than it has in the world in which we live today. It has different resonances, but they also underscore the way in which cliches about the terror with a capital T and the idea of arbitrary punishment, of show trials, are quite inaccurate. There are significant areas of the country, maybe as much as a third of the country, where this year, 1793, 1794, certainly represents requisitioning and conscription, but not arbitrary imprisonment and punishment and executions. So that we have a much more nuanced understanding of this period of emergency government that we call terror. At the same time, Lynn, I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is an extraordinary crisis. This is an extraordinary year in which huge numbers of people lose their lives, as many as maybe 350,000 people, which represents about 1.3% of the total population. We're talking about 150,000 French soldiers who die on the frontiers, a couple of 100,000 people who die in the west of France in civil war. There are maybe 30,000 people who go to the Revolutionary Tribunal and are executed. And that alone, those 30,000 people, represent per capita something like 6 or 8 times the death rate on our highways each year. I mean, we're talking about large-scale deaths. 80,000 suspects are imprisoned. So this is the great crisis of the French Revolution. It's a period of extraordinary sacrifice. It's a period ultimately of military success at a huge price, even if we need to be very careful of the dangers of using cliches about the terror and the reign of terror and so on. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of looking at it, because I think that one of the issues is, as scholars, we try to, we want to figure out not just the circumstances of the event, or the way that we should understand that it isn't just one block that was dreamed up by a group called the Jacobins who impose it then on the rest of France. I think that's very important to keep in mind, but it's also important to keep in mind the things that you're talking about, the kind of shocking quality of the events that take place. In particular, the executions, which it's hard not to see have a political side as well as obviously a wartime emergency side, and that there is something. This is why it's so exciting to study the French Revolution. There remains something at the core that is mysterious about this period, in the sense that things really do get going in a certain kind of direction. It's not that it has a logic exactly, but there is a kind of way in which things do propel forward that that will remain interesting and, to a certain extent, mysterious forever, because it's just an amazing period of time when all these things come together. Yes, we can explain it. Yes, we can contextualize it. And yet there is something about it that remains just, kind of overwhelming to think about. And I think you laid it out in a really wonderful fashion.
I think one dimension of what you're talking about the us needing to capture what is different and strange, in a sense, culturally distant from us, has to do with the way that historians of emotion are now understanding, if you like, the repertoire of emotions that people are going through at this time as a way of capturing the experience of people who live through this. I mean, when you think about the way in which the terror is so rapidly imagined when it's over as the reign of terror, and the quite extraordinary reconstructions that are made of that year immediately thereafter, that we would find quite fanciful and horrific, and yet obviously have a deep resonance for people who've lived through that period. I think that over the last 25 years or so, there has been a lot of very interesting work done on thinking through the panoply of emotional responses people have to these extraordinary experiences. The most obvious ones are the twin emotions of fear and elation, which I think both drive the revolution forward and explain a lot of the hesitations and violence of these years. But there are many other emotions as well through which people filter the experiences that they're living through. But I completely agree with you that one of the most exciting things about being a scholar of the French Revolution is the way that we keep being brought up short in terms of the capacity that we have to understand this extraordinary experience that people are going through.
Yeah, and if I could just add one last thing on that question about emotion, because I think one of the really interesting things that has come out, and in which I think there is, dare I say, even a kind of scholarly consensus, is we have definitely moved away from the idea that somehow there was a extremely strong central government in control of everything that was exercising totalitarian control over the population. Instead, I'm very much taken with the line developed by Jean-Clément Martin that what we really have is a weak state, a state that's in an extremely powerless situation, and the level of fear, which is in some ways hard for us to grasp, of those in power is extremely important to keep in mind, to understand how things could have developed in the way that they did, and why the idea of terror was so much in even the leadership's mind. It's not like they had complete control over the situation. So I really think there have been some really important steps forward in understanding this period without losing sight of the fact that it is just this amazing moment in world history that is going to continue to kind of bedevil us for, I'm sure, generations to come.
Yes, one of the things that my teacher Alison Patrick taught me was about the experience of those scores of thousands of public officials across France, people who are elected to positions of authority in municipal councils, but who are also public officials, and who had this extraordinary task of somehow translating what was going on in Paris and the decrees that were churned out into local languages and implementing them. And often people who were very vulnerable, very unpopular, and yet created this sort of tapestry of public administration at a time of extraordinary volatility. And it gave me a whole new understanding of the challenge of creating revolution in a world in which you cannot communicate readily in the way that we can with people in distant parts of the country. You're often talking about weeks and weeks that it took to get news and information backwards and forwards. Let's turn now and explore a little further this question of the resonance, I think, of some of the questions about the French Revolution for our contemporary world, because plainly the French Revolution is such a rich seedbed of debates and issues around rights in the broader sense, an area where your scholarship has been so important, very obviously for the question of gender and the rights of women and so on, but plainly the French Revolution is of crucial importance in terms of the rights of people of colour, as they're called, but other groups of people, even as we now know from Pierre Serna, the rights of animals as well. And I'm wondering, as a scholar and teacher, how you feel we should best negotiate our desire as historians to enable our students to understand the distance that separates us from the past and the need to respect that distance, and yet at the same time our students keep finding in the French Revolution questions about the rights of groups of people which still have a real impact and make the French Revolution so exciting to study. How do we negotiate that tension?
This strand edited by Ian Collar on whose revolution, I think, raises some extremely interesting and, needless to say, very relevant questions for today. But first, I want to say that these questions about rights, minorities, and even the question raised by Pierre Serna about animals, these are not questions that scholars have invented, that are being sort of imposed upon the French Revolution. Since we're interested in them, let's see what they had to say about them. It turns out that once we're kind of alert to these as questions, these are things that are going on in a big way during the French Revolution. Slavery is a huge issue during the French Revolution. The question of women, it's not that it's a huge issue in the sense that people are discussing it all the time, but there are amazing articulations of this issue that resonate right down today. And this is true, of course, for religious minorities, the rights of religious groups. Now, perhaps we would also want to talk about the rights of Catholics, not just the rights of Protestants and Jews, because those are also at issue during the Revolution. The Revolution does raise these issues, but then there is the question that you really pertinently raise of how do we teach this? Because obviously it's not a great idea to teach this as, look how retrograde everybody was in the past, because if that's going to be our message, it's true for all of the past, and then the past is not terribly interesting. The past doesn't measure up to us if we look at it in that way. What's instead interesting, it seems to me, is to look at how do they frame the question? How do they frame the question in the 18th century? And of course, what always got me was that the very idea of bringing these questions to the fore got people thinking about things in a way that they just hadn't thought about them before. So I've always been interested in the fact that you pose the question and things come up that you just didn't expect to come up. You have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and a whole lot of people who you weren't thinking about start saying, am I included in the rights of man and citizen? Am I not a citizen because of my color, because of my religion, because of my sex? So I find that if you look at the French Revolution, it gives you an enormous variety of responses of how to think these things through without just going to the anachronistic, moralistic, look how horrible they were in the past. Look how horrible they were in 1790 when they declared that the colonies were not part of the Constitution. Well, it turns out there was an enormous amount of agitation about this. It may not have shown up immediately in the speeches, but it was there in the halls of the assembly. Everyone understood almost immediately that slavery was going to come into issue, and what were they going to do about it? And the Revolution is a fascinating example of how difficult this question is to resolve in a way that makes everybody happy, how difficult it is to resolve, to think through all of its consequences, and how the raising of the issue brings people into action who wouldn't have acted in the same way before.
Yes, it's extraordinary, isn't it, the way in which the rights of particular groups or issues which we were previously told that was historically anachronistic to even think about those things. They just weren't issues at the time. As soon as we start looking, of course, we find, well, actually, they were issues. And one of the most exciting things, as you say, about the French Revolution is that the more we pose these sorts of questions, the more we find, well, so they were issues at the time. But as you say, Lynn, they were raised in a particular context in a particular way. And that is one of the most useful things, I think, for us as teachers, is that it enables us to explain to our students, well, yes, it's worthwhile keeping on asking new questions about the past, as long as we're also attuned to listening to the particular answers that people in the past had to those questions, and not simply castigating them because they weren't as enlightened as we are. That actually it's a very useful vehicle for understanding historical distance.
And I think this is something that students actually do really relate to. They are both interested in the fact that these things come up and that the answers given are not always the answers that they think should have been given, but then that also gets them interested in, well, how did they put together their world? Why did they put together their world in that particular way? This is just another one of these examples of why the French Revolution it just seems to me to be just an enormous reservoir of interesting things to think about.
And of course, in the process of our students becoming more sensitive to the answers that people gave to these questions in the past, it's also a way of them learning one of the most important lessons of an historical education, and that is to develop a perspective on themselves and the context in which we now live. And that we're not somehow at the end of an historical process. We ourselves are suspended in historical moments as surely as people were during the time of the French Revolution. We don't have all the answers.
Right. And we're glad we don't have all the answers, because it gives us still things to do.
That's right.
But that brings us actually to the strand organized by Guillaume Mazot on the French Revolution beyond the academy, because it's not just our students that we have to deal with, that we want to deal with, but it's also our general public of readers and viewers. And so talk to us a little bit about the kind of frustration that this strand reveals to us, felt by historians, about trying to both get the public interested, which sometimes seems to require leaving out some of the complexity and nuance, and the things that we want in our histories, which includes complexity and nuance. And this is especially true because many histories, as we know, are most successful when they kind of have a national bent, and that makes it very difficult for historians to come in with different kinds of views. So tell us, what was your feeling in thinking about these issues that were brought up by this fascinating strand of discussion?
Yes, these were really superb papers, and I think they, for me, expressed the frustration that I suspect historians feel in many societies, Lynn. That's to say that we're most comfortable, as you've pointed out, dealing with evidence-based argument, dealing with ambiguity, nuance, contradiction, subtlety. That's the way that we've been trained as historians, and yet we live in a world where politicians and the wider public prefer to make sense of the past through simple narratives, often of a very nationalist kind, or they make sense of the past through the history of great individuals. And there's often a great frustration that I think historians as a profession feel about our inability to somehow convey complexity and an evidence-based approach to history more broadly. It's particularly acute in France, I think, where the French Revolution is such a contested memory, and where still today issues around, for example, the meaning of the civil war in the west of France. You still have politicians arguing that it was a genocide, for example. Issues around the French Revolution are still so contested. But at the same time, I have a very strong feeling that despite the frustration that Guillaume Mazot and other people express, that historical discourse in France is still profoundly lively, that we live at a time when there has never been such richness of approach to understanding the French Revolution, such plurality. And in so many conversations, the French Revolution remains, and we're very fortunate this way, it remains, in a sense, the stranger in so many conversations that other periods of history have to negotiate. The French Revolution seems to be omnipresent in debates about other histories. It still has a resonance in the popular imagination. Sometimes it's a very negative one. I mean, for example, recently I was asked to write an historical blurb for a new board game for teenagers, which the board game consisted of working out who could guillotine the most people. That was the nature of the game. And I was asked, would I write an historical blurb saying what a wonderful game about the French Revolution this was? I declined. On the other hand, I've been teaching over the last 5 years a sort of free online course, not for credit, about the French Revolution, which has attracted across the last 5 years, I guess, up to 80,000 students. And the most interesting part of that has been the section where students are able to say why they've decided to spend some time doing an online course simply out of interest about the French Revolution. And the most common statement they make, and these are students from every single country in the world, is, I've always thought I ought to know something about this. I just feel that it's lacking, that I keep hearing references to the French Revolution and I don't know anything. and this is an opportunity for me to learn something. So my own view, I must say, is that despite the frustrations that we feel about the lack of resonance that our type of historical discourse can have in the public domain, we do have a public obligation to keep taking advantage of any opportunity that we have to do that. We live in a world of extraordinary richness, not only in terms of approaches to the French Revolution, but in terms of new methods of communication through social media, through blogs, through videos like this. And we do have to take advantage of that whenever we can. Do you agree?
Yeah, and also, the thing is that's so striking. Of course, it's the most true in France that the French Revolution is just everywhere. It's in the theater, it's in the movies. There's the wonderful interview in this strand with Pierre Schoeller about his movie Un Peuple sans roi. I saw that movie on a Delta Airlines flight. So it's not just France, although it's of course much more present in the historical imagination in France, but it in the Anglophone world, it has an amazing presence as well. There are new novels set in the French Revolution, historical novels set in the French Revolution, that come out, if not every year, certainly every couple of years in English. And I'm always quite struck by the fact that the people who write these novels are often doing a lot of serious research to get it right. So there's an enormous interest. There's still an enormous biographical interest in figures of the French Revolution, but of course films and theater. It's one of the things again that shows us is the enormous power of these events, the lasting power of these events to evoke strong feelings, not just in Edmund Burke or Charles Dickens, but over the centuries. It continues, and it's amazing to see how true that is. I think it's interesting about whether this will change in the future, and I wondered if you had a thought about this. Is the internet going to change this? My sense is, you're talking about your online class, if anything, the internet is going to make it more present to more people.
Yes, and it's going to be a challenge to historians to decide how best they respond to the range of new social media. Whether we need to start tweeting about the French Revolution, I don't know. But I admire enormously our colleagues who have set up online blogs and so on about the revolution. There are some very effective ones on Facebook and so on, where people are having serious conversations of a very different type to the ones that we were used to as young scholars. I think the Pierre Schoeller film, which I enjoyed so much and respected so much, is a very good example of the sort of tension that we're talking about, because, I thought it was a superb film. My only criticism really was that I think it missed an opportunity to have some sort of non-European presence in it. But I thought, and perhaps because he asked 4 of our colleagues to work as historical advisors, I really admired the respect for detail that he wanted to show in that film. And yet, the great problem that Pierre Schoeller had with it was that the French Revolution is so damn complicated. And it's the sort of film that the more you know about the French Revolution, the more you appreciate it. When I showed it to my students, the students who knew about something about the French Revolution were the ones who got most from it. It's had some very severe critics in France who found it too academic. Some people have been very rude and said it's a real bum number, that it's just too demanding. And it really does illustrate this tension that here's a very fine filmmaker who's wanted to make a very serious contribution to public understanding about the French Revolution, and yet is having to come up hard against the complexities of conveying something as dramatic and complicated as the French Revolution.
Right. And there's no question that this will be an issue. But I take this as entirely, in a sense, entirely positive, because it shows that the public is willing to come into contact with these kinds. In other words, scholarship could actually matter in new kinds of ways thanks to new media. And at the same time that we're worried about declining enrollments in humanities classes and history classes, in anything that's pre-20th century, these are real worries. I completely grant that. But I think the new media gives us new outlets for working out these kinds of issues. And I think we have to even more aggressively pursue our interests in them. Because as you say, some of us are doing blogs. Sophie Vanish is writing columns in Libération in which she frequently invokes issues about the French Revolution. Our colleagues in France, of course, come up with this much more often because it's much more actuel in some ways than it is in the U.S. or Australia or even Great Britain. But still, it's out there. This is an area which we can move in, and the more we make use, I think, of the new media, the better for us.
Yes, and it's worthwhile recalling that, of course, there never was a golden age when the citizenry were very well informed about their national histories. I mean, it's always been attention. It's always been attention, and one that, as you say, is particularly acute in France because the memory of the French Revolution has always been so hotly contested and has always been so political. So that during the Third Republic, of course, the primary school teachers were in a sense seen as almost the Republican foot soldiers of a secular education and a very positive understanding of the French Revolution. We're talking, of course, about, if you like, popular culture in our own times. The final strand in this fascinating forum talks about popular culture during the French Revolution and in the aftermath of the Revolution. That's to say, the type of material culture of everyday objects and so on that proliferated at the time. And I'm wondering what your response was to that as someone who's written extensively about the political cultures of the French Revolution. What did you make of this new emphasis on everyday material culture?
Well, as you can probably guess, I am wildly enthused about this strand, which I thought was just filled with amazing insights and new directions for us to think about, not just about the revolution itself, but as the Tom Stammers piece talks about, how we got to sort of get our sense of what the revolution is about, especially in terms of material objects, what got saved, who saved it, how it's been collected, where it's being shown, how it's being shown. These are all fascinating issues that, if I could put it together in one global statement, what they really show is thus just the amazing half-life of the revolutionary experience, made possible through these material objects. But what they really show is these objects continued to resonate, in some ways resonated in new ways over time. And this is a fascinating way to think about the sort of afterlives of the revolution. They're not really afterlives, they're sort of continuation, if you will, of the revolution. But I think the other thing that comes to my mind when I was reading these absolutely fascinating pieces was how wonderful it has been to have a crossover now with art history, literature, and history, all of us working together in some ways, in ways that are indistinguishable one from the other, and also at the same time that bring in the perspectives from these other fields to deeply enrich our understanding of what we interpret as being the French Revolution. So it's just amazing how these new perspectives have really brought new materials into our consideration and also taught us to think in a sort of more disciplined way about what these objects might mean. This is wonderful to me, and it shows how it shows how interdisciplinarity can really work when you can bring in the strengths of the different disciplines together to look at some of the same objects together. I just think it's a wonderful example of what we could call humanities research at its best, showing us how we can make sense of questions that are interesting across disciplines and that are just immensely enriching to us as historians of the French Revolution.
Yes, and really personified by the person who's edited this particular strand, Sophie Matheson, who has the classic training of a curator at the National Gallery here in Melbourne, but who's done a PhD in history of the prison artists of the French Revolution. One of the things that really struck me about this strand, as you say, Lynn, is the way in which there's a bridge being created between the old style, if you like, elite art history, where we wrote about this period in terms of David and Fragonard and Ingres, and yet there's now been this crossover from high art, if you like, into the world of ephemera and the creation of collections. There's been a bridging through a new approach to material culture more generally that's enabled a real bringing together of the art history of famous painters with the world of the people who were involved at the grassroots level in creating objects, whether they were lithographs or personal decorations, buttons, clothing, whatever. That this is coming together in a new way of understanding the way that people make sense of a revolutionary upheaval through objects, whether they're paintings, clothing, wallpaper, gestures, or songs. That they're part of a very broad political culture.
Yeah, and this is great also because it's part of a kind of a new interest in how it is we know the world, which is much more through objects and everyday objects than just reading important philosophical texts, which of course are important, and I do not mean to say that they are not important, but this is part of a whole new way of understanding cognition and understanding how we understand politics, which is through these everyday objects. So this is really important from that point of view. And I think it also demonstrates something that we saw with the strand on Whose Revolution, which is that if you look at the things that used to be categorized as not important, trivial, ephemeral, they don't really count, it's not lasting, it turns out, one, it is actually lasting, and it turns out there's a massive amount of evidence out there if you decide to look for it. So this strand, I think, again shows us that when you ask a new kind of question and you bring a new perspective to bear, it really it doesn't just enrich your understanding, but it fundamentally reshapes your understanding of how things work in this period.
Exactly. Lynn, I think maybe as a way of wrapping this discussion up, and again, we've appreciated, I know, both of us very much just the quality of these contributions, but it might be a good idea for you and I to reflect on whether there's another dimension that we feel was perhaps lacking. I mean, I know the editors aren't in any sense implying that these 5 strands are the only 5 strands worth investigating. For example, as for me, what I still find of fundamental importance about the French Revolution has to do with this being a nationwide as well as international upheaval, and it really takes me back to your initial doctoral work on those 2 provincial towns of Troyes and Reims. And I want to put it this way. One of the most important things we've learnt in recent decades is about the relationship between the French Revolution and its wider international, indeed global context, which we see as a complex process of negotiation and contestation. And I think we always need to understand the relationship between Paris and the provinces of France in the same way. That this is a revolution that involves all French people, and just as the relationship between revolutionary France and the countries around it and elsewhere is complex and dynamic, so the relationship between Paris and the other 90% of France is a complex, dynamic one, where the messages of the revolution are welcomed, accepted and adopted, or contested, rejected and fought against. But it's a complex, quite awesome type of experience, and one which I think is at the heart of the great shift of the French Revolution from an essentially aristocratic, agrarian type of regime to a new concept of property, new ruling elites that start to emerge through this extraordinary social upheaval that goes on. Part of that dialogue between Paris and the provinces is also environmental history, because one of the crucial concerns of successive revolutionary governments was the wave of both legal and illegal land seizures, land clearances, forest invasions and so on. The environment during the French Revolution goes through a profoundly traumatic experience, one which needs to be seen as part of the revolutionary upheaval, and one which needs to be situated through the broader context of 18th and 19th century French history. But issues of the environment, control of resources, whose revolution this is, to go back to one of the strands, are really at the heart of the French Revolution as a social upheaval as well. Is there something that you'd like to add as something that remains at the heart of your understanding of the revolution?
Yeah, there are two things I would add that I think are deeply related to each other. And they are, first of all, the military history of the revolution, because I think this is incredibly important for understanding the terror, for understanding the level of violence, for understanding the emergency situation, and for understanding the second thing that I would like to bring up, not just the study of wars and violence, but also the emergence of authoritarianism. You know, Napoleon is there at the end, Bonaparte at first, Napoleon later. But there's a way in which those of us who study the revolutionary decade itself tend to stay away from Bonaparte and what comes afterwards, because it's not the fun, revolutionary, exciting, controversial part of the revolution, but instead sort of something altogether different. But the more I read about Napoleon Bonaparte, the more I am like, I think this needs more anchoring in what happens in the 1790s. And given what has happened in the world today, since we are always influenced by what happens in the world today, and the rise of populism, so-called populism, certainly the rise of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, these are all issues that actually came up during the French Revolution. I think this is something we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about. How did this happen? And do we take the Tocquevillian line? It's the kings, it's the terror, and then it's Bonaparte? Or do we take the line, it's the Directory that destroyed the democratic strands of up to 1794 and paved the way for Bonaparte? Is it the wars? I think there's a lot to be done still by all of us on understanding how this emerged and lasted for as long as it did.
Yes, because we need to remember that one of the great insults during the revolution was to be accused of being the new Cromwell. That was the thing that hurt Robespierre more than anything else, when his opponent said, and that was his great warning as well, that about Lafayette, that reading back into the history of the 17th century English Revolution, the concern that that what might happen at a time of great division and internal conflict could be the emergence of some sort of military figure. So that, in a way, as you're saying, we need to not only ask the question, why was it that the liberal aspirations of 1789 ended with a period of terror in 1793, 1794, but just as important, if not more so, why did it end with Napoleon in 1799?
Right. Right. I mean, this is for me another example of how, you know, the reservoir is very deep of possible questions for us to look at, because it's just an incredibly exciting period of history that did so much to shape all of our modern options. It's certainly our modern political options, but also many of our modern economic, social, cultural options. It's a wonderful period to study, and these strands really bring back to us how there is just so much more to do and how much fun it's going to be to do it.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think by way of perhaps concluding this, once again, we'd like to thank the contributors to these strands for their superb papers. We really encourage members of H France and the wider historical community to take advantage to read them. And we've enjoyed in particular the opportunity to have this trans-Pacific conversation about these papers. Thank you, Lynn.
You know, thank you, Peter. It's been a joy, and thank you to our tech people here and in Melbourne who helped make this possible.
Indeed. Thank you.